The rope creaked under the July heat. Eliza Hart hung from her own cottonwood boots, dragging the red dust. His wife. 4 men below, not one of them sorry. A rider on the ridge, green poncho unhurried as a storm deciding where to fall. A rifle laid across the saddle horn. Nobody looked up. Then a crack split the silence and the rope jumped, and Eliza Hart fell, gasping, back into the world. If you believe the dead do not always stay buried, friend, subscribe to this channel and ride along. Tell me, what is the weather like where you are listening from tonight? Now, let us go back to the summer of 1883, Sutter's Wash, New Mexico Territory, where the law wore a deputy's badge it had no business wearing, and a man his own county had filed as dead had spent 6 years becoming something considerably more dangerous than a rancher. Eliza Hart had come to the Bar H the way a good many women came west in those years, by marrying a man who had clear ideas about land and water, and the kind of life that 2 willing people could raise from nothing in a country that still had room for that kind of building. Nathaniel Hart had filed on the Bar H at 24 years old, out at Sutter's Wash where the arroyo country gave way to flat grazing land, and the cottonwood along the south fence was already tall enough to throw shade at noon. He had married Eliza 2 years later, when she was 20 and he was 26, and they had 4 years together that were not easy, but were good, which is probably the most honest way to describe building something from the ground up in the New Mexico Territory in the years before the railroad finished settling where it was going. Then Nathaniel rode south, one October morning in 1877, to look at a lease parcel down near the Jornada del Muerto, and he did not come back. The county sent a man around 6 weeks later with what they had found at the Rio Pareco crossing, a horse recovered downstream, waterlogged and without its rider, and a slicker caught in the roots of a cottonwood tree on the east bank, and no body, which in that country could mean any number of things, most of them bad, and which the county, for its own administrative purposes, decided meant one thing only. They filed a death record for Nathaniel Hart of the Bar H, Sutter's Wash, New Mexico Territory, in December of 1877. The neighbors brought food and condolences for 2 weeks. Then they went back to their own troubles, which were considerable. Eliza had been 22 years old. The first winter alone was the one she never talked about afterward, not to the neighbors who brought food for 2 weeks and then returned to their own troubles, not to Cora, not to anyone. She had been a wife 4 years, which was long enough to make the house feel wrong at night when the fire settled, and the wind came down from the mesa, and there was no second set of breathing on the other side of the bed. She had cried exactly twice that winter, both times out by the well, where no one could register it. After the second time she had drawn up water, washed her face in the cold of it, and gone back to the barn to check the cattle, because the cattle did not care about her grief, and the winter was not going to accommodate it either. That was the transaction she made with herself in December of 1877. She would be allowed to feel it, quietly and out of sight, and in every other hour she was going to run the Bar H. She held to this arrangement for 6 years without significant deviation, which is not nothing. She had her younger sister Cora staying at the ranch at the time. 13 and sharp-tongued and naturally good with horses, the way some girls are before the world teaches them to keep their skills quiet. Eliza had not let herself go under. She kept the small cattle herd that Nathaniel had fenced in the west pasture. She kept the well uncapped, and the rope greased, and the water table measured the way her husband had tried to teach her, looking for the signs of drift and depletion that meant a well was beginning to fail. She kept her name on the deed and the note current with the county, and the fencing meant it as best a woman alone could manage, which in some years was better than it was in others. The Bar H was not much to look at. 2 rooms in the house, a barn that had picked up a slight south lean after a bad winter 4 years back, the north fence line always wanting new posts, but the well at the Bar H never ran dry. In a country where a summer could snap from ordinary heat into serious drought without a word of warning, that well was what Eliza had instead of a husband, instead of family within riding distance, instead of anything that could be borrowed against or sold without losing the thing entirely. It was also, as it turned out, the precise reason someone wanted to take the Bar H from her. Cora had gone to Santa Fe at 17, 3 years before our story opens. She had found work at a dry goods concern there, run by a cousin of one of the Wash families. Her letters came with regularity through 1881 and into the winter of 1882. Practical and observant letters about the city and the work and the way things were going. They grew shorter in late winter of 1883. By March, they had stopped coming. Eliza wrote 3 times and received nothing back, and she told herself that the mail in Santa Fe was unreliable, which was true enough that it served as a plausible explanation, and she held that explanation carefully in front of the other thing she was afraid of, which was that something had gone wrong with Cora, that the mail could not account for. The years between Nathaniel's disappearance and the summer we are talking about were not dramatic years, friend, which is worth saying plainly, because the ordinary life of a woman holding a ranch together alone does not produce the kind of events that make for easy storytelling. But it produces something in the woman that matters enormously when the events do arrive. Eliza had learned to fix a fence line in poor ground. She had learned to keep the cattle from drifting too far south in winter, and to recognize, before the animals themselves showed signs, when the grass was going to give out and they needed to be shifted. She had learned to deal with the County Water Commission, which was a Byzantine operation run by men who were not used to women knowing what the water table was, or having opinions about the tariff calculations, and who initially made the mistake of thinking Eliza's quiet politeness meant she could be given a higher rate than her neighbors. She had corrected this impression in a meeting at the county seat in the spring of 1879, in a manner that the commissioner still mentioned when her name came up, not admiringly, but with a carefulness that was close enough to respect for her purposes. She had, in those years, been lonely. This is not a complicated observation, but it is a necessary one. Lonely in the particular way of a person who has known what it is to not be lonely, and who can still, in the right light, feel the shape of the thing that is missing. She was not bitter about it, exactly. She had her work, which was consuming, and her neighbors who were decent in the way that people who need each other in a hard country learn to be decent. And she had Cora's letters for 3 years, and the memory of Nathaniel for 6. And she had the well that never ran dry, which is its own kind of company in a country that does not always provide any. But she had also, in those 6 years, built around herself a quality of self-sufficiency that was genuine, not performed, the real thing that you build when there is no one coming to rescue you from the necessity of building it. And that quality is what she carried into the summer of 1883, when Silas Roark decided that her well was worth more than her peace. This is who Eliza Hart was. In the summer of 1883, 28 years old, 6 years a widow and everything but the legal paperwork that the territory had filed on her behalf, running a small ranch alone on the strength of one well that never ran dry, and a character that bent but had not broken under the particular pressure of being necessary to everything around you, with no one to be necessary back. She was not a woman who dramatized her own situation. She had learned that the territory had very little patience for dramatizing and a good deal of use for quiet persistence. She had become very good at quiet persistence. It is worth knowing this about her before we talk about what she did when things got bad. Now let us talk about the man who came to take her ranch. Silas Roark was not a large man, friend. That is worth establishing at the start, because large men who do bad things in the territory are at least transparent about the mechanism of their threat. You can see what a large man is using. Roark was narrow-shouldered and pale-eyed, and he did his business with paperwork and patience. And the patience was the kind that comes from having discovered, through careful experiment, that most people will step back from almost anything if you make the documentation complicated enough and give them enough time to get confused by it. He had spent 3 years as a deputy tax clerk in Doña Ana County, where he had refined a talent for finding the crease in a land survey, the ambiguity in a deed description, the widow or the aging rancher who did not have an attorney and was not likely to get one before the relevant date on a payment notice arrived. He had since moved that talent north into the wash country, where the land was poorer but the water rights were becoming interesting to people in Albuquerque who were thinking about irrigation development, and where he had built the kind of operation that looks from the outside like ordinary commerce and real property. He did not travel alone. He rode with 4 men, and you need to know something about each of them before we go any further, because the kind of man a man chooses to ride with tells you what he believes the world is and what he plans to do in it. The Decker brothers were the first 2. They were not twins, but they looked enough alike that strangers often mistook them, which the brothers themselves had never bothered to correct. They did not speak much. They watched everything with a sustained, unhurried attention of men who have learned that waiting is itself a form of pressure, and that patience, properly applied, will accomplish most of what blunt force can accomplish with considerably less mess. They had once sat outside a sheep rancher's house near Las Cruces for 11 hours through the small hours of the night, just sitting their horses in the dark without moving. And when the man came out at dawn, they were still there, exactly as they had been. They did not hurry anything. They did not need to. Prine was the third. He had been an Army scout in an earlier period of his life, genuinely skilled at reading country and weather and the intentions of men at a distance. And he still had some of that skill in places. What he had lost, somewhere in the years between the Army and the present arrangement, was the ability to admit when he had read something wrong. The men who can never revise their assessment of a situation, friend, are the most dangerous to be around, not because they are competent, but because they are not, and don't know it, or won't admit it, which in practice comes to the same thing. Prine had killed 3 people in the past 4 years, and believed himself justified in each case, and the problem with that was not the killing but the belief. Callum was the 4th man, and the worst, and I will tell you why. He came from Tucson and had good boots and no retrievable history, and he was 23 years old, and what Callum enjoyed, what he was there for, was the specific moment when a person understood that they had run entirely out of options and road and help. He collected those moments. He stored them somewhere private and revisited them. He smiled at everything and meant nothing by any of it. And a man who smiles at everything, friend, is a man who has stopped finding anything surprising. Roark himself, his particular failing, the thing that had gotten him into the business he was in, and kept him there, was a love of tidiness. He wanted things finished. He wanted papers signed, deeds transferred, accounts settled and closed. He hated loose ends with a genuine visceral aversion, the kind of feeling that other men reserve for snakes or heights. He had an arrangement with a judge in Socorro and another arrangement with a land office clerk in Albuquerque, and through those arrangements he had built a system that looked, on paper, like a series of ordinary property transactions in a country where property was always changing hands. The untidy element in the summer of 1883 was a young widow at a ranch called the Bar H, and the well at the Bar H that had never run dry, and a man with money in Albuquerque who wanted the water rights contract by the 1st of August, and was not interested in extensions. Roark had sent Eliza Hart a notice in April, claiming a banknote against the Bar H property, a note that bore what appeared to be her late husband's mark, but that she had never seen before, and could not account for. She had refused to acknowledge it. He had sent a second notice in May. She had refused again, and had written a letter to the county seat that had disappeared before it arrived, which was a service his Albuquerque contact had quietly performed. It was now July, and the well was the only one between Sutter's Wash and the mountains that had not gone dry, and Roark was out of patience for the paperwork approach. He had come out to the Bar H once himself, in early June, without his men and with the look of a man making a courtesy call. He had the forged note in a leather folder, and he unfolded it on the porch railing and explained the payment schedule the way a bank officer explains a thing that is both unfortunate and beyond his control. He was patient and thorough, and he kept his voice at the register of a man who was only trying to help. She had read the note twice without touching it, noted the mark that was supposed to be Nathaniel's, and told him that her husband had been left-handed, and signed his name with the pen pulled inward, and that this particular mark was made by someone who wrote right-handed pulling outward, and that she was going to describe this specific discrepancy to the county recorder before the end of the week. He had collected the note without a word, refolded it with precision, and left. He was already working out the next approach before he reached the gate. She could see it in the set of his back, the careful way he kept himself from hurrying. A tidy man. He was going to need this resolve before August. He had someone waiting on a contract. He rode out to the Bar H on Tuesday the 15th of July with his 4 men, and he laid the deed and the forged note on the fence post, and he gave Eliza Hart a direct choice between her signature and the alternative. She told him, in language that surprised him by its precision and its economy, what he could do with the note and the deed both. He had expected something like this. He had the rope on his saddle horn before he ever dismounted. They put the rope over the south branch of the Cottonwood, the old tree Nathaniel had planted the first spring of their marriage, which by 1883 was big enough around that 2 men could not have girdled it with their arms. Roark stood below Eliza in the yard of the ranch she had kept alive for 6 years and explained, with the patience of a man who has predecided the outcome, that she had until she changed her mind, and he did not expect that to take long. The knot was not a killing knot. He was a tidy man, and he wanted a signature, not a coroner's inquest. But a woman hanging from her own tree with 4 men watching her in the afternoon sun making the dust bright and the yard strange, knows what serious looks like in a way that no written notice can communicate. She did not sign. She could not have told you afterward how long it lasted. 4 minutes, perhaps 8. The blood went thick behind her ears, and the edges of the yard had taken on the bright, strange quality that comes when the body is running out of what it needs. And she was not thinking about anything except the sound of her own breathing, which was not going well, when the rifle spoke from somewhere above the arroyo. A single clean crack, and the rope jumped and came apart, and she fell hard into the dirt below the cottonwood, and lay there with her face in the warm dust of her own yard, and her body making sounds she could not control as it pulled the air back in. She heard horses up on the ridge. She heard someone coming down fast, the hooves clattering on the rock outcrop above the arroyo. She heard Roark's voice go up for the first time in all her dealings with him. The brittleness in it that she had suspected was underneath the smoothness. She heard one of the Decker brothers say something short and hard, and she heard the sound of 4 horses retreating with a speed that was not quite flight, but was headed in that direction. Then a man's hands were at the knot on her wrists, sure and unhurried in the way of a man who has cut people free before, and a voice she had not heard in 6 years was saying quietly, very close to her ear, to wait before she tried to stand. She knew that voice. She had known it since she was 20 years old, and she knew it now in the dust below her own cottonwood. 37 years old and 6 years a widow, and still, in whatever part of a person knows things before the rest of them catches up, she knew that voice. Nathaniel Hart was 36 years old, and he looked nothing like the man who had ridden south on an October morning in 1877 and not come back. He was lean in the way of a man who moves a great deal and eats when it is practical and does not concern himself with comfort in the intervals. Sundark from the road, wearing a green canvas poncho that had seen enough country to have lost its shape but not its usefulness. He carried a Winchester .76 carbine that had the finish worn from the lever and looked like it had been used for something other than decoration. His face had gone still in the way that faces go, still when a man has spent a long time in situations where the wrong expression can get him killed. His eyes were the same color and the same quality that she had known when she was 20. She was not entirely certain yet what to do with that fact. He cut the knot on her wrists and helped her to the porch and went to the well and brought water, and they sat on the porch of the Bar H for a long stretch of time without speaking, because the things that needed saying were so many and so various that none of them could find their way to the surface first. Roark and his men had ridden north, Nathaniel had watched them go from the ridge before he came down. He had noted that they had not run. They had ridden with a deliberateness that separated retreat from flight, the particular pace of men who were going to regroup rather than disperse. That meant something, friend. A frightened man makes mistakes. A man who is merely inconvenienced goes home and makes a better plan. There was a lot that needed deciding before Roark's better plan arrived at the Bar H. They built a fire that night in the low hollow behind the barn, the spot where the smoke would not be visible from the ridge road, and they sat on opposite sides of it, the way people sit when they have a long distance to cover and no good way to start. Eliza had her color back, and the marks on her wrists were wrapped, and she had that controlled. Careful expression that she had been building and maintaining for 6 years, and she asked him about Cora first, before anything else, which told him she had already decided what the most important thing was. He had known this was the first question. He had been working out how to answer it since he came down off the ridge 4 hours earlier. He looked at her across the fire. At the mark the rope had left on her neck above the collar of her dress, at the particular steadiness in her face, and he concluded that she had earned all of it, every piece of what he knew right now. He began with the part she did not know. After he crossed the Jornada in 1877, a situation at a way station outside Truth or Consequences had put him between a man being beaten by 3 others and whatever was going to happen to that man, and he had intervened, and the outcome left 1 man dead. The 2 survivors had declined to bring the matter to the county because the county's attention would have required them to explain what they had been doing at the way station, and why, which was not a conversation they could afford. But the dead man had a brother in the territory, with the kind of money that purchases reach, and within 6 months of that night there was a price on Nathaniel Hart of the Bar H, substantial enough that going home meant bringing that price home, and the one thing he could be absolutely certain of was that whatever happened to him, the ranch and the woman on it should not become a target in a dispute that was not theirs. He had spent 2 years trying to work out how to write that in a letter. By the time he understood that there was no way to write it that was not also a lie of omission or commission or both, he had already started becoming someone else, a man hired to solve problems of the kind that had gotten him into the original difficulty, a man known in the territory by a name that was not his own and that he would not speak aloud at his own wife's fire. There was more underneath all of that, and he did not pretend there wasn't. There had been a period, he told her, not the first year but the second, when coming home would have been possible if he had been willing to accept what that possibility cost. He had not been willing. He had told himself, during that period, that his reasons were good ones, that protecting her was the thing and that exposing her to the danger of his situation was worse than the other thing, which was leaving her alone with no explanation in a territory that filed a death record on him and moved on. He had told himself that long enough that it had started to seem true, and by the time it stopped seeming true, he was 3 years out and the explanation had grown so large and strange that he could not find a starting place in it that would make sense to anyone who had spent those 3 years. Waiting. He had been a coward. He said this without embellishment, looking at the fire rather than at her while he said it, because it is harder to say honest things about yourself when the person you are saying them to has had to live with the consequences of the dishonest thing you did, and the rope mark on her neck was a vivid accounting of exactly what those consequences had included. She listened to all of it without moving or looking away. When he finished, there was a long quiet between them that the fire kept filling with small sounds. She had a particular way of being still, he noticed, that she had not had at 22. Then she told him 2 things. The first was that she understood why he had done it. Not that she was forgiving it, but that she could follow the logic, and that a man who could not admit a cowardice to himself was a good deal harder to sit across a fire from than one who could. The second was that she needed to know about Cora before they talked about anything else, and that what had happened between them was not resolved and was not going to be resolved by a single night by a fire, and that they were both going to have to carry that fact around while they did what needed doing and deal with it after. She was looking at him steadily while she said this, the way she had looked at things in her life that were complicated and necessary at once. He had seen that particular steadiness before, 6 years ago, in an ordinary room, and it had meant then the same thing it meant now, that she was going to do what the situation required, and she was doing it clearly with her eyes open, and that was more than he deserved from her, which he did not say, because there was nothing useful left in the saying. He had heard about the land grabs in the Wash country through the network of men who handled that kind of problem, and he had heard about Silas Roark, and he had come back now because what Roark was running had a second piece that most people in the Wash did not know about. The Gilded Rose Saloon in Sutter's Wash was the center of a scheme for moving young women who had come to the territory alone, women who had answered printed advertisements for housekeeping positions or teaching contracts, or sewing work in places like El Paso and Chihuahua, women who did not have family close enough to ask uncomfortable questions in time for the questions to matter. The contracts those women signed looked genuine from the outside and were criminal in practice, and not all the women who signed them arrived at their stated destinations. The money from the El Paso concerns flowed north through the Gilded Rose accounts, and the land acquisitions in the Wash provided cash when the other money moved slow. The two enterprises ran out of the same ledger under the same roof, and Silas Roark was the thread connecting them. Cora had answered one of those advertisements in February. Eliza did not move for a moment after he finished. The fire shifted. Then, with the same controlled voice she had been using since the porch, she asked where Cora was now. He believed she was alive, a contact inside the Gilded Rose operation. A bookkeeper who had been watching and waiting for the right occasion to come forward, had confirmed that the southbound stock train out of Sutter's Wash was running extra cars on Friday with a booking through the Gilded Rose freight account. He believed Cora was being held for transit in one of those cars. The train left Friday morning, which gave them until Thursday night. Eliza looked at the fire. Then she looked at her wrists. Then she looked at him with those 6-year careful eyes. And when she spoke, it was flat and certain in the way that decisions are when a person has had enough time to be very clear about them. She was not going to wait at the ranch. She had been waiting at the ranch for 6 years. She was done with waiting. He had not planned to ask her to wait. What he did not put into words, and what I believe she already understood without the words, friend, was that he needed her. Not only for the sentiment that was there between them, real and complicated and not going to resolve in a night by a fire. He needed her as a practical matter, because the piece of this that would hold in a court, the piece that would put Roark behind bars instead of merely at some temporary distance, required a witness who would be believed. A man known in the territory as the Sutter's Wash ghost arriving at a courthouse with a stolen ledger was not going to be believed, or if believed, was going to create complications that outran the problem. A widow with fresh rope marks on her neck, in a territory where 7 women from locked stock cars would shortly be available to give testimony, was a different proposition entirely. They spent the rest of that night making plans. He went through what he knew about the Gilded Rose operation. 3 men who managed the booking and contracts, a freight foreman who handled the stock train arrangements, and a ledger kept in a strongbox built into the wall behind the bar mirror that his contact had confirmed contained names, dates, contract numbers, and payment entries linking the El Paso money to the Gilded Rose accounts across 18 months of operation. The ledger was the thread that made both pieces of Roark's operation into one. Without it, everything looked like separate commerce, and lawyers could argue the separation indefinitely. With it, there was no argument worth having. She asked the most practical available question, how they were going to get the ledger without the strongbox and the men around it creating problems. He had thought about this. The supply corridor at the back of the Gilded Rose had an exterior door that did not lock from the outside on weekdays, which his contact had verified. He needed approximately 12 minutes in the back room. He needed whoever was at the bar to be looking at the front of the room and not the back. He needed her to provide that. She could provide that, she told him. She had been going into the Gilded Rose for 3 years to pay the water tariff, and no one had ever questioned her presence. A man called Prine had a habit of standing too close and explaining things she already knew, and on Thursday afternoon she could give him ample opportunity to continue that habit, and he would be entirely occupied by it. He had those kinds of habits with women, and needed very little encouragement to exercise them. He regarded this plan with the expression of a man experiencing 2 conflicting reactions at once and not resolving them quickly. She said that was fine, and told him what she had learned that morning at the water pump near the station agent's house. The southbound stock train was running 4 extra cars on Friday, not 2. The additional cars were booked through a Socorro concern whose freight account ran through the Gilded Rose. The cars were locked from outside. The station agent had not been told what they contained. They worked out the rest of it until the fire burned down to coals and the night got cold the way high desert nights do. Thorough and sudden, and Nathaniel went to sleep against the south wall of the barn, and Eliza did not, or not for a long while. She read through the forged deed by the dying firelight, not because she needed to, but because there is a particular anger you feed by looking at the instrument of what was done to you. And sometimes that anger is the most reliable thing you have for what the next day requires. She had plenty of it. She had been storing it for years. Somewhere around 2 a.m, she set the deed aside and went to the well and drew water and stood in the dark yard listening to the sound the territory makes when the heat has finally left the ground and the night animals are working, and the mesa is just a shape of black against the stars. The cottonwood was visible against the sky. The south branch, where the rope had been, was still and dark. She looked at it for a moment with the flat attention of a woman who has decided to stop being afraid of a thing because there is no more useful time left for being afraid of it. And then she went inside and laid out the 2 dresses she owned to determine which one was more likely to convince the bartender at the Gilded Rose that she was a woman who wanted a cool drink and a receipt, and not a woman who was running cover for a man stealing the most important piece of evidence in a criminal operation. She chose the blue one. She was practical about most things. Friend, there is something worth understanding about what it costs a woman to carry 6 years of that particular burden alone. To wake up every morning in a house that was built for 2 people and is now occupied by 1. To do the work that was always meant to be shared, and to do it without complaint and without any explanation that would make any of it make sense. It costs something quiet and deep, the kind of cost that does not show on the outside, because a woman who is necessary to everything around her cannot afford to let it show. Eliza Hart had been carrying that cost for 6 years on the strength of a well that never ran dry and a stubbornness that was, when you strip the circumstances away and looked at it plainly, the most durable thing about her. She had not broken. She had come close. In a winter 3 years back, when the cattle prices dropped and the north fence lost 20 posts in a single freeze, and there was a payment due to the county that she was not certain she could make. She had sat at the table in the 2-room house on a January night and done the arithmetic several times and concluded that the arithmetic did not favor her. And then she had gone to bed and gotten up in the morning and done it anyway. She had always done it anyway. And now, on a Wednesday night behind the barn of that same ranch, reading the forged deed that some pale-eyed man had used to put a rope around her neck that afternoon, she was still doing it anyway. That is the quality you want in the person riding out with you on a Thursday morning, to recover a ledger from a saloon strongbox and put a criminal in front of a federal marshal before noon. Not courage in the heroic sense, not the kind that announces itself and needs witnesses. The kind that is just still there when everything else has been taken away. Thursday morning came up hot and still over the Wash country. They rode into Sutter's Wash separately. Eliza first at noon to the dry goods concern where she had kept an account for years, and where her presence in town was as ordinary as weather, a thing the town registered without remarking on. She made purchases she needed, talked to the woman at the counter about the dry summer, declined a suggestion that the Bar H well might be on a favorable geological seam, and went about the slow, deliberate business of being visibly unremarkably present. Nathaniel came in from the west, off the main street, and found his way to the alley behind the Gilded Rose to study the supply corridor with his own eyes and time what needed timing. At 1:30, Callum was standing outside the saloon. He was not supposed to be there. He was supposed to be out at the northern property line of a ranch Roark had already transferred, doing the visible presence work that told the former owners the paperwork was final, and their options had narrowed. But here he was, leaning against the post outside the Gilded Rose with his good boots crossed at the ankle and his hat pushed back, and that empty professional attention of his moving across the street at irregular intervals, which was the most dangerous kind of attention, because it did not have a pattern you could count on. Eliza spotted him from across the street and changed direction without hesitating, went into the druggist's shop, and spent 7 minutes examining hair combs she had no intention of buying while she worked out whether Callum's presence changed the plan. It did not change it, she decided. It only changed the timing. She came out of the druggist's at 1:45 and walked to the Gilded Rose with the directness of a woman who belongs where she is going and has done nothing worth being careful about. And Callum watched her come up the street with those empty, cataloging eyes, and she went through the saloon door without looking at him. Prine was at the bar, as expected. He was 3 drinks into his afternoon when she settled onto the stool at the far end and waited for the bartender. And by the time she had her water tariff receipt and a glass of something cool she was paying to justify her presence, Prine had shifted his considerable person to the end of the bar and was beginning the story about the horse he had owned in Sonora. The horse had been an exceptional animal. Prine had always been quite clear on this point, and the story of its exceptional qualities had been acquiring detail and specificity with each retelling, until it had become, by this version, the account of an animal that bordered on mythological. Eliza listened to all of it. She listened to the commentary on the dry summer, to the editorial on water tariff administration in Doña Ana County as compared to practice in the Wash, to an opinion on the railroad's effect on cattle prices that ran on for several minutes and went somewhere interesting and then came back. She was wholly, attentively present. She asked 1 or 2 questions at natural intervals. Prine expanded with the enthusiasm of a man who has not often listened to so carefully. 12 minutes in, from somewhere behind her and across the room, she heard the faint sound of a door in the corridor. She did not look up. 14 minutes after she sat down, a man in a green poncho walked through the main door of the Gilded Rose with the unhurried purpose of someone who has finished his business and knows where he is going next. And Callum, still at the post outside, registered a man with an easy walk, leaving a saloon, and continued watching the street. The ledger was in the poncho. Eliza finished her receipt, thanked the bartender, listened to the opening sentence of a second chapter of the Sonora horse story, and declined it with a smile that gave nothing away. She walked out into the afternoon and met Nathaniel at the dry goods store where she had left her horse, and they read the ledger together in the back office the store's owner had made available. He was a man who owed Eliza a debt from a water-sharing arrangement 2 summers back, during the kind of trouble that the Wash country produced regularly for people who tried to manage cattle through a serious drought. And he asked no questions. 19 names. Dates going back to February of last year. Contract numbers and transit codes, and a notation key inside the back cover that matched transit codes to stock car designations on the Wash southbound route. Payment entries in 3 columns that linked the El Paso concerns to the Gilded Rose accounts, to what appeared to be a payoff line running to an Albuquerque land office address that matched the clerk Roark used for his property. Filings. Cora's name was the 14th. Contract dated February 1883. Transit code matching stock car B. They were at the rail yard by 8 that evening. The stockyard ran along the south edge of town, behind the grain warehouse, separated from the main street by a board fence, and the warehouse building itself. 2 watchmen, one at the gate and one on a walking circuit. Nathaniel had timed the circuit twice from different observation points and was confident in the pattern. Eliza went in through the grain warehouse by the east door, which had been left accessible to her on an informal basis since a hail season 2 years back when the warehouse keeper had needed extra hands, and Eliza had provided them, without asking what it was worth. Which is the kind of favor that people in isolated country remember. 4 cars at the far end of the line. The extra capacity beyond what the Socorro booking specified suggested either optimism about volume or growth in the operation since the booking was made. Car B was the second from the end. The lock was a heavy bar and padlock combination, and the padlock lasted less than a minute against the bolt cutter from the Bar H toolbox that had been in Nathaniel's saddlebag since he packed for this ride. He had packed it because a man who plans ahead about equipment has fewer problems with equipment. 7 women inside. Cora was one of them. Friend, I am not going to perform what those 7 women had lived through for a stranger's comprehension. Some things are not owed to a story. I will say that Cora was alive, and that she was on her feet within a moment of the door coming open, and that when she saw her sister in the doorway of that stock car, she did not cry right away. She looked at Eliza with the specific expression of someone who has made a decision about not waiting for rescue, and who is now, with surprising speed, revising that decision in real time. Then, in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be, she mentioned that she had been wondering when someone was going to get around to it. Eliza held her for a long time, and did not try to answer. Getting 7 women through the grain warehouse and to safe houses in town took 4 trips, and most of 2 hours, and required the kind of attention to the circuit watchman's timing that leaves no room for error. Nathaniel's contact had made arrangements with a woman in town, the druggist's wife, who had been quietly warned that evening, and who had been quietly useful to people in difficult situations before and knew how to do it. By the time it was finished, the eastern sky had the dark purple that comes an hour ahead of dawn. The courthouse. That was the next and final piece, and it needed to happen before Roark found out about the car. Eliza had sent a wire 2 days earlier to a federal marshal in Albuquerque, routed through the telegraph office in a town 12 miles east, where no one had reason to connect the message to events in the wash. The reply had come back. The marshal was in Santa Fe and could reach Sutter's wash by Thursday evening or Friday morning. At first light on Friday, she sent a second wire from the town telegraph, and the reply came back in 20 minutes. He would be at the courthouse at 10 o'clock. Silas Roark arrived at the courthouse at 9:45. That early arrival told you something about how confident he was. And confidence of that kind, friend, the kind that comes from having run a tidy operation for long enough that you believe the tidiness itself is protection, is also a blindness. He was carrying the deed and the forged note and a letter from the county seat clerk that a competent lawyer would have flagged immediately. He was not carrying a gun. He had never needed a gun at a courthouse. He had men for that, and the men were dispersed this morning at various points around the wash country, each doing work that he had assigned based on a morning that was supposed to be straightforward. He walked into the circuit judge's chambers at 9:50 and found 3 people already waiting. Eliza Hart, with the rope mark still visible on her neck above her collar, and an expression of absolute composure that she had maintained for 6 years under harder conditions than a courthouse meeting. A federal marshal from Albuquerque with the badge and the paperwork to back it up. A man in a green riding poncho who had placed the ledger open on the judge's desk at the 14th page, and who was standing to one side with his hands at his sides, and the particular stillness of a man who does not fidget or bluff. The judge was a circuit man from Taos, named Herrera, 16 years on the territory circuit, and he was reading the open ledger with the concentrated patience of a man who has understood that what is in front of him is going to require a great deal of his attention in the weeks to come, and who has accepted that it will. He was not one of the judges in Roark's arrangement. Roark stopped inside the doorway. He looked at the ledger, open on the judge's desk. He looked at the federal marshal. He looked at Eliza Hart, who was looking back at him with the direct, steady attention of a woman who has spent a long time practicing not looking away from things that frighten her. His hand moved toward where his gun would have been. He had not brought his gun. Nathaniel made a short, clear remark about that, The marshal added a longer one of a more official nature. Roark's hand stopped moving. Outside the courthouse, an hour later, the Decker brothers heard the news from a man at the telegraph office, and looked at each other with the expression of men who are methodical and patient, and are calculating whether patience and method can serve them in what they now face. They concluded that it could not. They rode north out of Sutter's Wash before noon. The territory was large, and patient men can generally find other employment in it, which is perhaps not the conclusion to this chapter that justice strictly requires, but it is the one the territory provided. Prine heard about it in the Gilded Rose at 10:30 and knocked his glass over. He sat for a while looking at the table and then left through the back, which is what men like Prine do when the situation becomes one that their pride cannot reframe as a thing they chose. He got as far as Socorro before the marshal's office there received the telegram from Albuquerque, and a deputy found him at a rooming house, sitting on the bed with his hat on his knee in the posture of a man who has been deciding whether to keep running, and has concluded without particular enthusiasm that the arithmetic no longer supports it. Callum heard about it last and from a stranger at the livery stable, and he listened to the whole account with that empty-eyed expression that gave nothing away, and thanked the man pleasantly, and rode south. He was never brought in for what happened in Sutter's Wash, and I will not tell you that fact without the bitterness it deserves, friend. But a man who spent his life collecting the moments when other people ran out of road had, after Sutter's Wash, to do his collecting with one eye permanently behind him, which changes the flavor of the hobby considerably. Roark went to Santa Fe in irons on the Friday evening stage. The Ledger went with the marshal. The circuit judge issued his ruling that afternoon, voiding the forged note, and restoring the Bar H deed to the name that had been on it all along. A territorial hearing 3 weeks later addressed the 7 women from the stock cars. The Socorro concern and the El Paso arrangement were unwound in the months that followed. Some of the men involved faced courts. Some did not. The territory was what it was. Now, the hardest part. They came back to the Bar H on Friday afternoon, the 3 of them, and Cora had found a hat somewhere in the preceding hours, and had organized herself into a series of practical opinions about the immediate future that she delivered to Nathaniel at intervals throughout the afternoon with the specificity of someone who has had time to think and has made thorough use of it. The hat suited her. The opinions were not inaccurate. Nathaniel received them with the expression of a man who knows he is right to submit. That evening, after Cora had gone inside and acquainted the kitchen with her preferences at some volume, Eliza and Nathaniel sat on the porch and watched the sun go down behind the western mesa. It went down the way it does in that country, suddenly and completely, and the air cooled with the quickness the high desert keeps in reserve for after sundown. He told her the name, the one he had been carrying instead of Hart. She knew of it the way most people in the territory knew of it, as weather rather than as biography. She was quiet with it for a while. She asked whether he was staying. He was staying. She looked at the mesa for a moment and told him the north fence line wanted new posts before fall, and that she had put it off for 2 years because the ground out there was hard, and digging post holes alone was different from every other kind of work. He had noticed the north fence on the ride-in. Good, she said. The Bar H did not become a different ranch in the weeks and months that followed. It stayed what it had always been, small and honest, and situated on land that was not rich, but was reliable. The fake mortgage was gone. The 4 men who had found the place useful for their purposes were gone or in irons or running, which, for the purposes of the Bar H, was the same outcome. The woman who had kept the place alive for 6 years alone was no longer alone. That is not the same as having more, but it is something, and on some days something is enough. Cora stayed through the fall. She found a position at the county recorder's office in Sutter's Wash before winter, where a woman who could read a property deed with skeptical attention and ask pointed questions about its provenance was exactly what the office had needed for a long time without knowing how to ask for it. She rode out to the Bar H on Sundays. She continued managing the list she was keeping on Nathaniel, which had been organized by category. Nathaniel was not easy to live with. He will tell you that himself, without embellishment or excuse. The years had put certain things in him that did not come out easily, a vigilance that did not entirely switch off, a preference for perches with sight lines, nights where sleep was something that arrived late if it arrived at all. Eliza handled these things in the practical way she handled most things, without performance and without pretending they were not there. There were conversations that took months to surface. There were some that never did. There were mornings when he was gone before light, up on the ridge where he could see the country. And she understood this the way you understand the weather in a place you have decided is home, not as something to argue with, but as the actual shape of the thing you are living with. He had been a gunslinger for 6 years. He was a rancher again. Neither of those facts canceled the other out. They lived with both. The town of Sutter's Wash watched all of this from a careful distance. Towns in the territory have a way of rearranging their collective memory of events to match the outcome. And the people of Sutter's Wash, who had for 2 years watched Silas Roark move through their affairs with the smooth confidence of a man whose paperwork was impeccable, discovered after the courthouse morning that they had, in retrospect, always suspected something was not right about him. This is how small towns protect their own dignity after the fact, and Eliza understood it without bitterness. The town had not come out for her on the day Roark strung her from the Cottonwood, which was a fact she knew, and filed away and did not bring up at the water pump or the dry goods counter or anywhere else. What the town could give her now was the ordinary commerce of being a neighbor, and she was practical enough to take it. The post holes on the north fence got dug before the first freeze. The barn's southern lean got braced with new timber that winter. The well at the Bar H kept being the well at the Bar H, deep and cold and reliable when everything around it was not. The cattle on the west pasture came through the autumn in better condition than any season in the past 3 years, which Eliza attributed to the improved attention, and which Nathaniel did not argue with. Being a man who had learned, at considerable cost to himself, when to let someone else have the last word on a subject they know better than you do. The Sutter's Wash ghost was not entirely retired. Anyone who thought he was had not been paying attention to the right things. But he was home, and in the long accounting of what a life amounts to, home counts for more than most men will admit, until they have been away from it for 6 years and come back to find that it was still there, still standing, still exactly what it was, because someone who loved them had never stopped holding it together. That is the story of the Bar H and the Cottonwood tree in Sutter's Wash in the high summer of 1883. The law wore a badge it had stolen. A man his own county had buried came back to settle what he owed. The territory called men like Nathaniel Hart dangerous, and was not wrong. The territory also called women like Eliza Hart necessary, and was not wrong about that either. Sleep well tonight, friend, wherever you are listening from.